Everyone, thank you for joining us today for this talk, part of the series of talks at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, Recode AI, here at the Institute of Computing, University of Campinas, Brazil. Today, I have the pleasure to count with Ani Kembhavi. He's a researcher at the Alien Institute for AI, AI2. He leads the perceptual reasoning and interaction research called Prior team at the Allen Institute for AI in Seattle. He is also an affiliate associate professor at the Computer Science and Engineering Department at UW, University of Washington. His research interests lie at the intersection of computer vision, natural language processing, and embodiment. Prior to AI2, he spent 5 years at Microsoft Bing, building large-scale machine learning systems in the image and video search relevance team. He obtained his Ph.D. under Professor Larry Davis at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I had the pleasure to know him this year when I attended an event by MIT called NTech MIT. He was a speaker there, and just after that, I reached out to him and invited him to talk to us, and he kindly accepted. So, Ani, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. I will stop sharing my screen, and the stage is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anderson, for that kind introduction and also for this invite. Let me just share my screen. Please let me know if you can see the presenter mode or if you can see if everything.
It's perfect.
Okay, great. Today I'm going to talk about building general purpose vision systems, or rather, this is a project that we've started in our team almost 18 months ago. And we're taking the first steps towards building what we call general purpose computer vision systems. I'd encourage people to ping me if you have any questions. Feel free to interrupt or ask questions or ask me to go back a slide and so on. If this is interactive, that would be great. Okay, so let's begin. So a lot of work in computer vision, especially a lot of work that has happened post the beginning of the deep learning era, has been on building very, very powerful specialized computer vision models. These are models that perform a single task really well. So for example, we have very powerful image classification systems. You give an image, it'll tell you if it's a cat or a dog or a mouse or a turtle, etc. Or you can give an image and it can give you a depth estimate at every pixel in this image. So these are special purpose systems. They are built for one task. And in fact, they're also built for one particular data set. If you want to take one of these systems and get it to do another task, sometimes it's just not possible. And sometimes you need to make some non-trivial architecture changes. What's interesting is that the models that we're building today, especially in the research community, are also dataset specific. If I have an ImageNet classifier and I want to take this ImageNet classifier and want it to classify scenes or places in the places dataset, I must make architecture changes. I must train the last layer. I must decide how to change the learning rates for the initial layers and so on. So these models are quite constrained. Then on the other hand, researchers have also built multi-purpose models. So these are models which are designed from the very beginning to perform more than one task. So now you have models that can do detection and segmentation together, or you have models that can do captioning and visual question answering together. But once again, the models that are designed for multi-purpose tasks are designed for a predefined set of tasks. They're designed for these 2 or 3 tasks. If I want to do a 4th task, once again, I must require architecture changes. So to summarize, the state of computer vision today is n-purpose models. Is usually 1 for single purpose, but sometimes n greater than 1, but it must be pre-selected. So in research group at AI2 at the Allen Institute, we are trying to move away from end-purpose models and build general-purpose models. The thing about general-purpose models is that N, which is the number of tasks that they can do, can be very large. But importantly, the number of tasks and the kind of tasks are unknown when you're actually designing the model architecture. So the system is expected to encounter new tasks and also adapt to these new tasks at test time. There are three tenets or three principles of general purpose vision systems that we sort of use as our guiding principle. The first tenet is generality of architecture. So we're trying to use a very general purpose architecture without any task-specific components. This architecture must support lots of different tasks, including tasks that we have not thought about. The second is the models that we are building must be able to generalize concepts across skills. I'm going to leave it at this because I'm going to explain what I mean by concepts, what I mean by skills, and what I mean by the generality in a few slides. And the third tenet is generality of learning. We'd like these models to be able to learn new tasks with minimal loss to the old task that was trained on. So let me go through these tenets one by one and show you how we've tried to make progress in this direction. So the first tenet of GPV is generality of architecture. We want a very general purpose architecture that can support many, many different tasks. So here we are sort of motivated by biological systems. We don't have components. I'm talking about humans here, but this is true of any biological system. We don't have task-specific components in our inputs and outputs. The modalities that we sense are not designed to just detect cats versus dogs. Instead, they are modalities that are very general purpose. We can touch something to feel the texture, we can hear something, we can taste, we can see. And at the outputs, we can act, we can move, we can speak, we can make different kinds of noises. And so in a sense, you can think of biological systems as having some general input modalities, general output modalities. And these modalities are very few in number, but they can support lots of tasks. So if you want to create a new task, you don't have to add a new head to your biological system like you do for a neural network. But these models that we have in biological systems can easily adapt to all of these tasks. If you look at NLP, natural language processing, you'll notice that NLP has already made a lot of progress in this direction. Of course, they have this huge advantage that they have, well, primarily one modality, right? Words or letters that make up words, that make up sentences, that make up paragraphs, that make up documents. And so NLP has moved towards encoder-decoder architectures. You input a modality, you output a modality. And now with this very general architecture, they do all kinds of things. They do translation, they do question answering, they do sentiment analysis, a host of different tasks. In fact, if you look at recent models in NLP, you're also seeing examples where these models can actually learn how to perform tasks simply by a description of the task. This is truly getting towards general purpose. So instead of giving it a very, very large data set and training for a specialized task, they train on many tasks and they simply say what task one must perform. You can give it a sentence in English and say, translate this sentence from English to German or English to Portuguese. And the model must understand what the task is and then perform the task. So how do we do this in computer vision, especially when we have so many different modalities and specialized systems at inputs and outputs? So let's take an example of a few different tasks that computer vision researchers work on. And this is by no means exhaustive. It's just some examples of tasks. So classification, visual question answering, object localization, examples of very, very popular tasks. And you'll notice what I have on the vertical axis here are different output modalities that we typically produce in our models. So for example, classification, we provided an input image and the output is a class label. Of course, in ImageNet, for example, the output is just category number 6, but it does correspond to some text label, dog or cat or elephant, right? So the output is text. Object localization, which is like detection, requires a box output. So you have bounding boxes and you have some region relevance scores, some probabilities of that box being that particular category. Depth prediction, the output must be an image, right? The input is an RGB image, the output is a depth map. In fact, if you look at many, many different tasks in computer vision, you start noticing a pattern that a lot of these tasks share the same output modalities. And this is a guiding principle to how we're thinking about building general purpose vision systems. So here's a model of the first vision system that we built earlier this year. Of course, there's lots of boxes and lots of arrows, but let me try to abstract away the important components of the system. If you look at the full left of the screen, not sure if you can see my mouse, but the entire left of the screen, you'll notice that the input is an image. This system has been built for images, not for videos. So the input is an image. The image goes through some sort of, let's say, a visual encoding mechanism. In this case, we have the visual encoding mechanism being an object detection system using the latest transformer architectures. Then there's another input, which is text, which tells you what to do with the image. So you can say, describe this image if you want a caption, or you can say, what is this if you want classification? Or you can ask a question like, what is the dog sitting on for visual question answering, etc. So this goes through some sort of text encoder, and we use BERT to encode this. Once you have visual encodings and text encodings, you have some sort of cross-attention layer. This layer basically allows grounding of visual concepts in language and linguistic concepts in vision, and allows mixing of concepts to produce contextualized embeddings. And then you have your outputs. The output can once again either be text, which is useful for tasks like captioning, or it can be bounding boxes with relevance scores, which are useful for other tasks like localization, detection, grounding, etc. So you can see at a very high level, the model architecture is actually very simple. There's no task-specific components, but there are modality-specific components. So what I showed you is a general purpose vision architecture. So a general purpose vision architecture also demands a very, very general purpose training mechanism. And our training mechanism is also very simple, very vanilla. So currently, we train on 4 tasks. We have localization, categorization, visual question answering, and captioning. In every mini batch, we take roughly an equal number of samples from these 4 tasks. And then we have loss, our loss functions are not determined based on task, but are determined based on modality. So for example, when we produce text, we use negative log likelihood. When we produce bounding boxes, we have a Hungarian loss. When we produce relevance scores, we have negative log likelihood, etc. And the resulting model can do a variety of tasks simply based on text descriptions. So what I'm showing here are examples of inputs and outputs. And so the way to read this diagram is to use colors. So when the input is red, the output is the red box on the right. What color is the dog? It'll tell you that the answer is a color. It'll say brown. You can ask it yes, no questions. Are there trees being seen? It'll answer the question. If you ask it to locate the dog, it will give you the bounding box with the probability. If you say generate a description, it'll give you a caption, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing here with this particular model, with GPV1, is that it produces lots of different modalities. It produces text, bounding box, and relevance scores. But it doesn't need to produce some of these modalities for some tasks. So for example, what color is the dog? All it needs to do is answer the question with text. But it also has the capability to produce bounding box and relevance scores. And we use these additional modalities as a sort of a interpretable mechanism to see what the model is looking at. And it's quite interesting. When you say what color is the dog, you look at the top 2 bounding boxes. the highest probability is in fact the dog, which is used to answer the question, but it also looks at other objects in the scene like the cat. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the second guiding principle of GPVs, which is generalize concepts across skills. Now, let me first explain the idea of skills and concepts. So when I'm talking about concept, I'm talking about noun, verbs, and adjectives. For example, in this slide, the concept I'm referring to is dog. Skill is the function that you want to run in order to determine the output of the system. So for example, a skill could be answering questions about images, or a skill could be writing a caption, or a skill could be drawing a bounding box. So let's say that at training time, we train the model for the skill concept pair, which is answer questions about the concept dog. So for example, it can, if you ask it what color is the dog, it can say white. What animal is this dog? Is the dog furry? The answer is yes. So this is one combination that it has seen during training, answer questions about dogs. Now let's say at training, you've also taught it to do a second skill on a second object. So localize cats. So every time you give it a training example, like find all the cats in the image, this must draw bounding boxes around the cats. Or you can even give it, don't find the cats, but find all the cats that are looking to the left, or find all the cats that are white in color. It still is the skill of drawing bounding boxes based on your textual inputs, and the concept it needs to identify are cats. So let's say we've trained it on questions about dogs and bounding boxes about cats. Now, to be a truly general purpose system, what we would like this model to be able to do at test time is perform the skill concept combinations with the red question marks. If it knows how to answer a question, and if it knows what a dog is, right? And if it knows what a cat is, it must be able to answer questions about cats. This generalization is very important because when we collect training data, we should not have to collect training data about every concept. This just completely blows up when you go to lots of different skills and concepts. You should be able to collect some training data that covers some concepts in some skill combinations, and your models must be able to generalize this at test time. So with skill concept generalization isn't really a new aim of our field, but we don't really have good data sets to test for this particular ability. So in order to do this, we created a new split of the COCO dataset. Now the COCO dataset, as most of you probably know, is a very popular dataset with hundreds of thousands of images. And it has 80 primary concepts, right? So there are 80 concepts, for example, with bounding boxes in the COCO dataset. But there are many, many different skills, many sort of data sets that have come up using these COCO images. There's, of course, the base data sets were classification and localization. Then people did captioning with COCO. People did question answering with COCO, etc. So you have 4 skills and 80 concepts. And the way COCO is built today is you just have training images for all of these skills, you have validation, and you have test. So we sort of redistributed these images within COCO in this manner. First, we took all of our 80 categories, and we divided these categories into 3 parts. The part that you're seeing now highlighted in black is held out categories for VQA and captioning. What I mean is these are categories which never occur for the skills of VQA and captioning. So we took all the data points in COCO for all of these tasks, and then we made sure that we had a split where the word bed or the word cell phone or the word horse was never present for a question answering data point or a captioning data point. So that was the first split. The second part of the data set was held out from classification and localization. So here we have categories like bananas, broccoli, donut, hot dog, where you never had any training data for classification and localization. So these were 10 categories. And then we had 60 categories which were present in all skills, right? So the motivation of this particular split is as follows. We would like to train models where you provide, for some categories, you provide all your data. So Apple, you provide classification information, you provide bounding box information, you provide questions, you provide captioning. All of this data is provided to the model about Apple. But when you look at banana, which is present here, you do not provide it for classification localization. You only provide information about bananas for a different skill like VQ and captioning. At test time, however, you need to now measure how well can I localize, how well can I classify bananas. And if I can do that well, it means I have been able to generalize the concept of banana from one skill to the other skill. That's the motivation of the COCO-SKI dataset. By the way, COCO-SKI simply stands for COCO Skill Concept Evaluation. So here's the sorts of results that we obtained. And these were results using our first model that we built for GPVs called GPV1. So what you're seeing here are 4 different tasks. And the numbers that you see are all set. But we also break it down into seen and unseen. Seen means that these test samples, the concepts that we're measuring in seen were also present at training time. Unseen means these concepts were not present at training time for that particular task. So the model must have generalized a little bit. So the first thing that we measured was specialized models that other people in the community had built. So these were models that you're probably familiar with, models like FastStart CNN, models like ResNet, models like Wilbert. And you can see that these models do fairly well, but their performance on unseen drops a lot. Then we have our GPV1 model, which is trained only for one task. And the first thing you'll notice is that across the board, the GPV1 model does at least as good as a specialized model. And this is really good news for us because our model is very simple, it's very generic, and still is very competitive with highly specialized models. Now, if you do multitask GPV1, you get improvements for most tasks. And importantly, your improvement is noticeable for the unseen category. So for example, for VQA, the single task model was getting 41, and the multitask model gets a good 6-point improvement. And you can see similar numbers across the board. So this shows that the GPV1 model, at least to some extent, is able to generalize concepts across skills. But of course, you'll also notice that there still is a significant gap between seen and unseen, which we will further shrink using a new model called GPV2. And here what I'm showing you is the oracle performance. If a model had seen all concepts for all, how well could it do? And you can see that this gap still remains large. And this is a gap that we hope to shrink in the future. Okay, the third tenet of GPVs is generality of learning. So here we'd like our models to be able to learn new tasks with minimal loss of performance on previous tasks. And this is also the guiding principle which we have made. We've just started making progress. So I'm just going to show you some preliminary results. So there are 2 core challenges of generality of learning. One, the models must be able to learn new tasks efficiently. And 2, as they learn new tasks, they must not forget their old tasks. So what you're seeing here on the graph on the left is the ability of the GPV1 model to learn new tasks. So the orange lines are the GPV1 model that has been trained in a multitask setting. The blue lines are GPV1 model that has been trained only for one task for localization. And we're taking these 2 models and saying, I'm going to teach these models a completely new task called referring expressions. Referring expressions is a task where you have a sentence like the dog eating the bone, and then you must draw a bounding box around the entity described by this caption. So it's sort of similar to detection, except it's not a category, it's a sentence or a phrase. And so you can see that zero-shot performance, which means we have never given it any training data for this task. We simply just ask it to run on the test set. The orange curve is many points above the blue curve, which indicates that training in a multitask setting already gives you a fair amount of boost for a new task. And then the curve shows you that multitask training also improves sample efficiency. So as you provided more and more samples in your training data, a multitask GPV can learn more efficiently. But of course, these results aren't spectacular. There's a lot of research to be done to improve these numbers, but it's promising. The graph on the right measures as we give it more and more referring expression data, and as we get better at our end goal, how much do we forget old tasks? And I won't go into details here, but the summary of our findings is that if you train in a multitask setting, you also tend to forget your tasks slower, which is good news. We do not want to, ideally, we don't want to forget the tasks at all. But if we do, we want to forget them very slowly and very little. Here are some qualitative examples of our system. So let me first go through the first row, and then you can find more examples on our archive submission. So here's an image of two people trying to play a video game. So you can ask, what is the woman doing with her hands? It says playing Wii, the Nintendo Wii. You can say generate a description, and it describes the two people playing a game with remote controllers. If you say find the people, it draws bounding boxes around the people. If you zoom into the controller and say, what is this? It says it's a remote. So you can see these sorts of models start becoming quite powerful at performing lots of different tasks. And here are examples of the new task that we've talked about, which is referring expressions. So a small white dog sitting on a bench, and it does not provide both the dogs. It only provides a bounding box around the dog sitting on the bench. Whereas if you say, sorry, I'm just moving my mouse here. Whereas if you actually provided some training data, not zero shot, it can continue to do better. So you can say girl in skis who's standing and is wearing teal. There are many, many children in the snow here, but it locates the person correctly. Okay, so what I've spoken about so far is using traditional computer vision datasets to build general purpose vision models. And to do this, we use the COCO dataset, and we used a custom split of the COCO dataset. Now, there's many such computer vision datasets, and these datasets provide supervision for lots of different skills, but they provide supervision for some concepts, 80 concepts. Of course, we'd like to build models that have much larger vocabularies, an ability to provide bounding boxes, segmentation, VQA, and lots of different tasks for many, many concepts. In fact, we'd like to build models that can go to 10,000 plus concepts, right? So how do we do this? Well, one way to do it is to say, all right, I'm just going to collect a bigger COCO dataset. But the COCO dataset already cost, presumably, tens of thousands of dollars to build out. In fact, probably cost more than $100,000. So if you want to go 2 orders of magnitude, this approach is simply not going to scale. So how do you do this? So the approach that we are proposing is to use this unique ability of general purpose vision systems to be able to factorize the notion of skill and concept. So we're proposing that you use traditional computer vision dataset to learn skills, just like we did for GPV1. But then you learn concepts from a completely different source. You learn concepts from image search, like Google image search or Bing image search. Now, image search produces very, very good results these days. The reason they're able to produce such good results is that they can leverage not just computer vision, they can leverage text. They have millions of users clicking on images, so they can also leverage click data to filter their results into a unique set of good results for lots of different queries, millions of queries. So why not use this power to learn concepts? Web data will not teach you skills. It'll just teach you appearance information. For example, hibiscus is a type of flower. It'll teach you what a hibiscus is visually. And then if you can learn skills from computer vision datasets, you should be able to caption images with hibiscus. You should be able to answer questions about hibiscus, etc. And importantly, this can keep the cost down. So traditional computer vision datasets have already been collected. So in a sense, for our project or for other projects that build upon our work, they're free. And getting tens of thousands of queries from Bing or Google API is actually very, very inexpensive in comparison to collecting this large data set. So a large data set might have cost $1 million. Bing API, with about $100, $150, you are able to collect more than 1 million high quality images. So how do we leverage this data? So before I talk about leveraging this data, let me tell you a little bit about a web dataset that we have collected that we'll be releasing. So we call this Web 10K because it has, of the order of 10,000 concepts. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about is what concepts are present in Web 10K. We have roughly 12,000 nouns. These nouns have been sourced from natural language resources like word corpus, have been sourced from the conceptual captions dataset, and care is taken to remove words that are non-visual in nature, like the word humor is also a noun, but it's hard to produce a single image about the word humor. We want concepts like plants and animals and places and people and professions, etc. So we have about 12,000 nouns. Then we have almost 300 verbs. These verb lists are sourced from lots of different data sets that deal with actions in both image and video. Once again, we remove verbs that are not referring to a particular agent. So we want verbs like holding, catching, running, because there's an agent involved. The agent may be a human, maybe an animal, maybe a plant, etc. But we are removing verbs that do not have an agent, like snowing. And then we also have adjectives, almost 150 of them, which are also sourced from many, many different data sets. Here we remove adjectives, for example, which are relative, bigger, smaller, because from a single image, it's hard to know if this is big, this is small. You must have two images to determine this. Once we have this large set of concepts, which is almost 12,000 of them, we use the Bing API to download images, and then we convert this dataset to a question answering format with very simple templates. So when, let's say you have an elephant image and the query was elephant, the question can be, what object is this? Answer elephant. If the elephant is drinking water, you can say, what is the noun doing, which is what is the elephant doing? And the answer is water. And you know the answer because that's what you put in the query. In the query, you put elephant drinking water. So you know, what is the elephant doing? Drinking water. What adjective type is this object? So you can say, what color is this elephant? And you know it's gray because that was the query you put in, because you put in the query gray elephant, dark elephant, orange tiger, white tiger, etc. And so we have almost 1.5 million questions. And then we take a small subset of these questions, roughly 5,000 each, and we create validation and test sets. And for these questions, we get them manually verified on Amazon Mechanical Turk, because we want our validation and test sets to be extremely high quality. And just to give you an idea, we found that roughly 80% of our data, roughly 85% of our data was extremely high quality as verified by Turk, which shows that web data is at a high bar that can be used to build computer vision systems. Here are some examples of data that exists in Web 10K. So in the first matrix here, you're seeing examples of nouns. You can see that there's lots of fine-grained categories: daffodils, bulldozers, pistachios, armchairs. And then for some of these categories, we also have lots of different verbs. So if you look at buffalo, we have images which are buffalo eating, buffalo resting, buffalo plowing. For armchair, we have different types of armchairs. We have leather armchairs, modern, striped. So you can see that this is a very, very rich source of data with nouns, verbs, and adjectives. Sort of, it's not a full dense matrix. We don't have every verb for every noun, but it is far more dense than other data sets that exist today in computer vision. Here's a plot of the different concepts that are available in web data. What you're seeing here is a TSNE visualization of a word embedding for every query. And then the color codes refer to different super categories that these queries belong to. So for example, in purple, you'll see animals. So this is not an interactive graph in PowerPoint, unfortunately. But if I were to hover over purple, you'll see dogs and cats and buffaloes. And then pink are tools, light pink are food categories. So there's lots of different super categories in our web data set. And the circle sizes refer to the number of images that we have for every category. So there's a pretty uniform distribution, as you can see. There are a few categories with very few images, but for the most part, it's fairly uniform. So how do we train? So we have this web data that we want to learn concepts from. We have COCO data, right? The original data set we want to learn skills from. So let's train this together and see if our models can do well. So why don't we just train GPV1? So we used to train on 4 tasks. We can simply add a 5th task saying web question answering. And now each mini batch can take a sample from all 5 tasks. Let's train this. Well, there's one problem. The problem is that our model that we built was built in a way to be very good for COCO, but it's simply too slow. It has a very high computation requirement. Even on just the COCO data, GPV1 took between 5 and 7 days to train. And the web data is much, much larger. And so we'd have to wait 2 or 3 weeks just to perform one experiment. And so in order to have a model that's even more lightweight, even simpler, even more general, we proposed a new model called GPV2. So GPV2 has an architecture that is much simpler. And let me take you through this architecture once again. So on the very left, just like in the GPV1 diagram, are the inputs. You will notice one change. GPV2 had 2 inputs, the input image and input text. We found that many tasks can benefit from a 3rd input, which is a bounding box. You know, sometimes you have an image, you want to point at a part of the image and ask a question about a part of the image. You don't want to crop that part because then you lose context. You want to provide the whole image, but you want to highlight a portion. So now GPV2 has an input, which is called an input bounding box, a user-defined box. Then the input image and the input bounding box are consumed and provided to an object detector. So in GPV1, we also had an object detector, but that object detector was part of the whole system. In GPV2, what we did was we modified the code a little bit so that this object detector can now be frozen at training time, which allows us to cache features, which makes GPV2 much, much lighter weight to train. We can think of it like a 2-step approach. We take images in our training data set, run an object detector, cache these features. And so now we do not have to run this object detector at training time, which means lower memory and faster throughput. Disadvantage is that we're no longer backpropagating gradients into the object detector part of the model. But our results will show that even without this backpropagation, GPV2 is much better than GPV1. If you look at the outputs now, there are 2 kinds of outputs. There's either an output, which is one text output for the entire image. So if I want to do image captioning, I want to write a caption about the entire image, so I can do that. But now we also have text outputs for every bounding box. In GPV1, each bounding box only came with a relevance code. Now, each bounding box comes with a text output. And of course, these text outputs also come with relevance scores. At the core of this system is the T5 model. T5, of course, is a very powerful system in NLP with an encoder-decoder architecture. We leverage this powerful language model as the core computation mechanism. Importantly, we have a shared decoder for all our tasks. If you want to decode the entire image, you use some parameters. If you want to decode a particular bounding box, you use the same parameters. Sharing parameters within the decoders leads to a much better skill concept generalization, as our numbers will show. Okay, so now we have GPV2, and we want to train this once again, just like we want to do GPV1 on COCO data and on web data. So everything remains almost the same. We use an object detector called WinVL, which is a very powerful object detector trained on lots of data. And we cache these features. In a sense, we freeze this object detector. Then we jointly train on 6 tasks. So there are 2 new tasks from GP1. First, of course, is the web QA, which is this new task. And the second new task is called classification in context, or CIC. This is very similar to classification, except instead of just providing an image and saying, what is this image? You can provide an image, point to an object in the image and say, what is this object in this image? So this is another interesting task that we've added to our system. Everything else remains the same. You have a mini batch, you take a mix of samples from all 6 tasks, you have losses that are not task dependent, but are modality dependent, and you train your model. There are 2 additional steps that we found can really help our model. One is called classifier recalibration. What this means is that whenever you ask a question like, what is this? And the answer, let's say, is a dog, it comes with some probability. When models are trained on some categories, like let's say they're trained on the ImageNet categories, they become very biased to producing high probabilities for those words and low probabilities for any other words. So if you train on, let's say, 1,000 categories at training, you have a new category at test time, the model just assigns low probability to that particular category just because it says, well, I've never seen this category at training time, so it's probably not that. This just requires a recalibration step of the model outputs by reducing the log probability of the seen classes. And I can provide details later or offline if you like on how we do this, but this really helps generalization to new concepts. And the second thing is something very similar to what other researchers have found is very useful, is pre-training. The way we do this is we take the conceptual captions dataset. We don't do any sort of mask modeling or any complex losses. We simply treat this dataset as a captioning task. We provide the image, we say describe the image, and it must provide the caption. And we pre-train this for 8 epochs on this dataset, and then fine-tune this model on COCO and WebDenki. Okay, so how do we evaluate these models? In GPV1, we use the COCO ski dataset. But GPV2, especially with web data, has tens of thousands of concepts. COCO only has 80. So how do we evaluate this? So first, we'd like to evaluate on in-domain. It's all great learning 10,000 concepts, but if you do poorly on your base 80 concepts, that means you've forgotten your basic concepts. So we must evaluate on the COCO dataset. So that's the first thing we did. The second thing we did was we created a very similar dataset to COCO called diverse concept evaluation. So this has going from 80 concepts to almost 500 concepts. I won't go into the details here, but you can think of the set as very similar to all the tasks in COCO, except we're moving to open images. So open images has 600 categories. We used most of these categories with a little bit of filtering, and we got data from different sources, and we built the diverse concept evaluation dataset. And the third dataset, of course, is the WebDenki. We have a validation and test set that has been verified by Mechanical Turk. So let's see how well we do on 10,000 concepts. A very similar table to what I had last time, except now we have 3 datasets. Red is COCO, yellow is DCE, which is 500 concepts, and blue is web, which is 10,000 concepts. And we test models on 5 tasks across these data sources. So we test 3 models. First, we test our own GPV1. Then we test our own GPV2. And then third, we also test a model called VLT5. VLT5 is a model that has very similar, sort of a very similar philosophy to our research. They're trying to build a model. This is from the University of North Carolina. They're trying to build a model by unifying vision and language tasks through a unified interface. Of course, this model cannot do purely vision tasks like localization, but it's still worth comparing to this model. For each model, we do 2 comparisons. We say, let's train this model on COCO, and let's train this model on COCO plus web, so that we can see, can we learn concepts from web data and use this concept information at a variety of scales. So first we said, let's look at our GPV1 model. Can this model learn from web data? GPV120, the superscript 20, which is rows B and C, are basically the GPV1 model that has been trained only for 20 epochs. And the reason, like I mentioned before, is that this model is just too slow. And so we had to train it only for a few epochs. And of course, we did it comparably so that you can look at the differences. The first thing you'll notice is that on the COCO dataset, adding web data does not produce major degradations. So that's good. It does not forget COCO concept just because it has a high vocabulary. But on the DCE and web datasets, you can see huge improvements between rows B and C. So it is able to learn from web data and improve captioning on DC, improve VQA, improve localization, improve classification, etc. When we look at VLT5, which is someone else's model, this model is also able to use web data and improve on the DC and Web 10K datasets. This is very promising. This is a model that we have not designed, but it shows the power of thinking about training in this factorized way. And then, of course, is GPV2, which is the model that we propose. And here we find that web data helps, and GPV2 is able to outperform other models. I've painted this nice rosy picture, but there's a little caveat here. The caveat is that we've used pre-training. Pre-training is just lots and lots, millions of captions across the web. And these captions contain an unbounded number of words. They may contain most of the words in our Web 10K. So you might ask me, well, isn't this cheating? You're saying that you're learning this information from verbally supervised data, but maybe you're just learning it from caption data. That's where your improvements are coming from. So in order to provide a very clean experimental result, we performed another experiment. What we did was we took our models and we removed pre-training. We removed WinVL features, which are powerful detection features. We only used information that was within our COCO ski dataset. So there is absolutely no chance of any leakage happening from any other data source. And now we trained our model with only COCO ski and with COCO ski plus web data. And this is just sort of a laboratory setup to say, can this model learn from web data and apply it to other tasks? And we did see healthy improvements in this laboratory setup, which shows that the architecture is capable of doing factorized learning. Now that this model has learned, let's say, 10,000 concepts, it should be able to perform lots of different tasks zero shot. It has learned lots of tasks, it has learned lots of concepts. Maybe it doesn't need training data on other tasks. In order to do this, we tried 2 tasks. One was verb recognition. So this is called situation recognition. So you can say, what are they doing? And you'd expect the model to output a verb. There's the data set called in situ, which we looked at in a zero-shot way. So what you're seeing here in the red curves are the bottom line is 68.6. This is top 5 accuracy for verb recognition. If it is fully supervised, which is 68. If we use our GPV2 plus web model, we get 34 in a zero-shot setting. This is, I would say, respectable, but not outstanding. Then we did an analysis to say, well, why are we getting only 34? And so we looked at all the verbs in ImSitu. ImSitu has 500 verbs. We used 300 of them. There's an overlap of roughly 250 or 280 verbs in our web data. Whenever we have overlap, whenever our web data contains the verb, the number shoots up to 54, which means that tomorrow, if you want to do well on ImSitu on the entire data set, perhaps if you just get more web data, which is very cheap, you will be able to close this gap. The second data set that we looked at was attribute recognition, where you want to ask, what is the color of this object? What's the texture? Is this made of wood? Is this made of metal, etc.? Here we pose the answer as a yes, no question. And here what's interesting is in a zero-shot setting, and this is a large data set for supervised models get 68. We are able to get 52, which is really respectable because we use zero training data. Another thing that we found very interesting about GPV models is that, this model is very generic. It can do almost anything. So you can think of it like a little function that you can use in a programming interface, right? So you can use the same model with different inputs and it will give you different outputs. So there's a task in Vision that many of you may be familiar with, which is human-object interaction. So the goal of this task is draw a bounding box around every human being and tell me what they're doing. And so we said, okay, let's not train this model using some complex techniques. Let's just repurpose GPV2 in a sort of a recursive way. So the first time we'll say locate the people, and then it'll produce a bounding box. And then for each bounding box, we'll say, what is this person doing? Because now we can point at things if you remember. So it will hopefully tell us what that person is doing. And so here's just a simple, nice example to show how you can change GPVs for complex tasks. So here, locate the people, it tells you the person with the arm up and a little person sitting inside the plane. And for the person in the blue box, it says this person is directing the airplane, whereas the person in the red box, it says this person is sitting on an airplane. So this is quite interesting. And hopefully this will lead to some more interesting uses of general purpose vision models in the future. I'm going to end with some qualitative examples of what these powerful models can do. So in the past, models on Coco, if you say, what is this? They would have said bird, whereas models that have learned from web data can tell you more interesting things like this is a blue jay, this is a mallard duck, this is a kingfisher. Or it can identify fine-grained materials about objects in your life, like this is made of glass, marble. If you look at localization, buses and cars are commonly seen in datasets, but which one is the SUV? Which one is the school bus? Which one is the pickup truck? Or can you locate different musical instruments? Musical instruments, vehicles, animals, birds. There's lots of training data using web search like Google search and Bing search. And this model has now been able to take classification data from there and do localization. Similarly, its vocabulary is extended. So what is this lady doing? If you look at models without web data, they'd say the lady is sitting or this lady is cutting, whereas here it has the extended vocabulary to say this lady is harvesting. Okay, I'm going to end my talk with one slide about limitations and then summarize. So we've built GPV1 and GPV2 using web data. And we see lots of potential in this research direction, but there are also many limitations. First, we don't have any support for generating pixels. And this is actually something that we've been actively thinking about adding in the next generations of GPV. Pixel generation is not just important for generating images, but also for doing segmentation. After all, segmentation is just coloring pixels with different colors, or doing in-painting, or doing image manipulation in certain ways. These are all very useful tasks that our models are unable to handle today. Second, we support images and text, but we don't yet support videos and audios, which are also very useful. Third, we've shown that these models can generalize concepts across skills, and web data is very powerful. but we believe there's still room to grow, and there's a lot of work that can be done to do this more effectively. We feel that data is already sufficient in terms of web data, but the architectures can probably continue to improve. And fourth, we have no explicit way to handle forgetting. We are just, in a sense, pre-training and training models with lots of data. And we expect that better architectures will forget less, but there's nothing explicit done in these architectures, and that's more room for research. So to summarize my talk today, we've built vision models that are general purpose systems moving away from end purpose systems. We've used 3 tenets or 3 principles to guide us. We want to build general architectures. We want these models to generalize concepts, skills, and we want these models to be general learners. We've presented GPV1 and GPV2. These are 2 of our works that we've worked on for the past few months as architectures towards this goal. And we've shown that you can use these architectures along with cheap web data in order to scale these models to very, very powerful systems capable of detecting and localizing and writing about tens of thousands of concepts. And that's all I have today. This project was done with some wonderful collaborators at the Allen Institute, as well as Professor Derek Holm at UIUC. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Annie. Excellent topic and presentation. I will jumpstart with one question, especially because you mentioned it at the end, and it was my first question, but the first thing that came to my mind was the catastrophic forgetting.
Yes.
So you mentioned that right now you don't have like a explicit mechanism to deal with this, but during your experiments, have you seen any sign of forgetting that you could think, okay, perhaps we should put some specific mechanism here to deal with forgetting? And regardless of the answer, do you have already something in mind to deal with forgetting?
So I think it is, so, when you pre-train on certain tasks, and if you fine-tune on some new tasks, we have noticed that models do worse on old tasks. I don't have a mechanism or an idea right now on how to prevent forgetting tasks, but I think we should be able to improve this architecture to prevent forgetting concepts. So if you've pre-trained and you've seen lots of dogs, and you want to fine-tune on, I don't know, species of flowers, we should be able to introduce memory banks into the model. We've seen this in vision, we've seen this in NLP before. If you have memory banks, if you have a way for models to write into memory concepts, I think you should be able to leverage memory banks to at least reduce forgetting concepts. The reason I say I don't have an idea about forgetting skills is, at least conceptually, when I think of a concept, I feel like, okay, I can produce a feature vector that summarizes the appearance of dog, and I can put it into a memory. Then I can retrieve it later in case I've forgotten dog. I don't really know how to do that for, what does it mean to produce a feature vector for question answering skill? So that's why I don't have an answer to skills, but I think concepts is something that we can reduce forgetting in our next incarnation.
Very nice. I have a question now from my student, Rafael. He is a senior PhD student. He mentions awesome presentation. Thank you very much. The framework that you described could be very helpful in other visual textual domains, such as medical tasks. So, however, in this type of domain, data annotation is very expensive and hard to obtain. And we probably can't rely on image search due to the sensitive nature of medical tasks. How would you approach training an architecture such as GPV star in a domain with fewer labels available?
I would say that one thing that we have not explored at all in the GPV world, but I'm sure it'll work really well, is all the recent advances in self-supervised learning. So self-supervised learning with contrastive learning, we know that a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the visual architecture training can be done without any layers. In the medical domain, if you have no medical data, then that's very difficult, very challenging. But if you have medical data with no annotations, which presumably, I think there are datasets like this that exist, we should be able to pre-train our GPV architectures on this sort of data. Then, hopefully, with very little data, we can still, perform many different skills on this medical domain architecture, on medical domain images. I don't have a golden answer for you, but
have you tried? Have you tried with in your experiments controlling the number of data points that you use for training? For instance, you mentioned here, of course, the best result that you obtained, but have you tried like with 10% of the data that you collected and evaluated what was the impact?
Yeah, actually, we did this experiment just 2 weeks ago. So what we did is we said, well, if we can learn skills from Coco, why don't we don't need 1 million images to learn a skill. Why don't we just reduce it? And we went to 10% data. And we found that on some skills, 10% data, there was no degradation. On some skills, there was a huge degradation. So when I mean this, I mean, we have web data, which is the whole thing because it's cheap. And then we have skill data and we reduce skill data only. And we're noticing that like captioning, there is no reduction. Question answering, there's a huge reduction. So we've just started looking at this. So I don't have an answer for you, but yes, that is something that we want to move towards, is efficient learning.
Have you observed what kind of skills that you are like losing performance? I mean, are those more abstract and hard to define skills? Are the ones that are good, are the ones that are more concrete, easy to define? Have you observed this yet?
We have not done that analysis yet. I am hoping, let me just tell you my hope. My hope is that exactly what you said, basic things like recognizing colors. You don't need question answering data for that. You just need to understand the language. Web data can teach you how to do colors. So I'm hoping that the analysis shows that basic skills we should be able to learn with very few data points. So, some complex skill like finding two objects, comparing their colors and seeing if it's in a third object, sort of compound skills, maybe you need more data points. That's my hope. We're still doing this.
Nice. Another question now from my student, Gabriel. Thanks for the amazing presentation. He sent me a WhatsApp here saying that he was loving the presentation. He has two questions. The first one, you mentioned that you trained with batches equally balanced along tasks. However, have you tested with unbalanced batches in order to focus more on a task than on some others? I mean, how do you know that equally balancing batches along tasks is in fact the best strategy? Would not it be possible to have different balancing strategies depending on the data set?
So why did we try balanced batches? Because that was the most vanilla, the most simple way to do. We have not tried unbalanced batches, but one of our researchers in our team is interested in the following problem. Imagine that I have a target data set. I want to do well at this target data set. How do I choose my batches so that I can do well on this target data set? If that target data set has balanced information, maybe balanced batches better. If it has unbalanced information, maybe unbalanced batches better. But we don't want to sit and do this manually. We want to do this, he calls it self-guided learning. Look at your validation data set and change your batch sampling, change your task sampling, sort of on the fly. So to answer your question, we have only done balancing so far, but Tanmay in our team has started doing some experiments in a sort of to take this project in a different direction.
Dynamically smart batches construction.
Right, something like that.
Another question, how explainable AI plays its role on general purpose models. I mean, how to highlight or explain the knowledge learned by the model when we consider multi-modalities? That's a very hard question. Gabriel, I'm proud of this question.
It's a hard question because you can provide almost any answer without proof, right? I can say, well, our model has learned to ground these concepts and there's no proof of it.
Yeah.
I think the advantage of having models with a linguistic interface, like a model where you can ask a question, is that my hope is that we can start asking the model what it knows about certain atomic things. So for example, we can probe models to see what they've learned. Probing is a little different from explainable, right? Like, because explainable, at least to me, means I asked it a question, it gave an answer. Why did it give it this answer? That's different. That's more complex. Probing is a little simpler. I'm going to ask it 10 questions which have to do with dogs. How well does it do? It can tell me, has this model learned some atomic concepts? I think probing is possible. Explainable AI, there's a whole community, as all of you know. So I would say this question is better suited for that community.
Okay, very good. Well, as we had this difficult question, let's continue with another one that's also difficult. You are using web data, and we all know that data coming from the web, they have all kinds of biases and biases and etc. Yes. So how do you see this kind of general purpose vision models scaling up in terms of adoption and skills and everything, but also taking into account the bias problem?
Right. So we thought a lot about bias in our web data. So for example, the kinds of bias that this web data has, and we'll write a little bit about this when we put this up on archive, is if you look at certain professions, it'll be dominated by one gender in this data. At certain professions, it'll be dominated by the other gender, right? These are sorts of biases that I think people are slowly starting to study over the last couple of years in computer vision datasets. Web is even worse because it is based on people clicking, and people will click on something that is controversial, something that is out of the ordinary, and it sort of propagates that higher and higher in the web rankings, right? Like any of our other social media problems. So that is a huge problem with our web data as well. We have not in this model done anything specific to de-bias the model. But there are people in our field and also at AIT who work on debiasing. And so one of the things that we want to start thinking is, if you're going to build general purpose models, they really need to have a component which is the debiasing method. Fantastic question. We are guilty of not doing enough yet, but hopefully we will in the next few months.
And do you anticipate that you could do some cross analysis? I mean, you mentioned the problem of professions. At least in Brazil, psychology, for instance, is one profession that's dominated by women, but we have like engineering, which is dominated by men. Do you see the possibility of crossing the data somehow and forcing some perturbations to deal with this kind of bias? I don't know. I'm just like brainstorming here because the data is complex. It's coming from the web, but you cannot have a debiasing algorithm that's also complicated to deploy, and you're going to need data. So it's kind of complicated. I was wishful thinking here. It's like perhaps we could just like cross information of skills and concepts in the training, and perhaps this would learn the general idea. I don't know.
I think that's interesting. What you're suggesting is like we have skill concept and you can introduce more dimensions, right? And so you wanted to do factorized learning. You don't want it to learn that in Brazil, psychologists are women. You wanted to learn the appearance of a category, appearance of a profession. And now if I ask it to say, what is this? It can say this is a male psychologist, this is a female psychologist,
Exactly.
right? Like,
Yep.
So I think that's a great idea from an architecture point of view. I'm going to think about that idea. That's good. The other work I want to point out was recently there was some work I saw a few months ago where they were doing data augmentation. So they were modifying an image. I don't know if it was with a GAN or with some other mechanism to switch the gender. So
yeah, that's something interesting as well.
Right. So you take an image, and I mean, doing it for gender, but you can do all sorts of biasing, right? Like a school bus. School bus is heavily biased towards yellow color. But maybe, I don't know, maybe there's a country where it is blue in color.
Well, here
so
it's
now,
not yellow at all.
What color is it there, a school bus?
It varies a lot, but normally here it's white or black. It changes, but it's hard to find yellow.
Right. But if you build a computer vision data set based on American images, and if you deploy it in Brazil, it will look at a bus and say, this is not a school bus because it's not yellow, right?
Yep.
So you can use a GAN or something to sort of identify the attribute which is biased and then flip that attribute at training time.
Yes.
So, and changing color is possible, right? It's possible to do that using image manipulation today. Changing gender is hard, but changing color is so maybe at data augmentation time, we can do this. And you probably only need to do this once, right? You only need to like create a data set and a function that can augment it. And this function can be plugged into any model. I think that is one way to do it.
Very nice. Final question here from my colleague Alexandre. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. My question goes toward one type of task that is very common to us, comparing things. So in GPV1, you removed adjectives like big or tall from the input. Would GPV2 be able to compare two different identified objects, or do you have plans for that?
We don't have any plans for it, but there is a very interesting data set called NLVR. I forget what it stands for. I think it's natural language visual reasoning or something. I think it's from Cornell. This data set provides, most computer vision data sets provide one image as input and one output. This data set provides two images, and you have to do comparisons. You have to say, which image has more bottles, or which image has bottles upside down? Is it the left or right? And it's sort of visual comparisons. So one thing that we were thinking with in last summer was to say, well, can we create a model that can take any number of images? So you can do set operations. You can do one image, you can do two images, you can do 5 images. You can say, rank these images by the number of people in them, right? So I think this is, do you have plans for that? I don't know if you have plans, but we have thoughts. So we're at that stage.
Very good. Hani, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation and rich discussion at the end. So you are more than welcome to appear more times. If you need like good students, I have some to recommend whenever you have openings.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and take care. And guys, thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hani. Bye-bye.
Good evening. Bye.
Good evening.